Hello everyone, welcome to Connect.Tech 2020. My name is Sia Karamalegos and I'm going to talk to you today about font loading and performance and user experience with fonts. As I mentioned, my name is Sia and you can find more about me on sia.codes, including some articles and everywhere you can follow me. I'm pretty active on Twitter, so if you want to DM me with questions, feel free to. I am the Green Greek on Twitter. Let's get started. So, where can you find the slides? You can get these slides at bit.ly/font-perf. All of these things are links. It is a live website, so you can access everything that's on it. Why should we even care about performance? Uh-oh. Do I need to reload? What's happening? So, user experience. 53% of mobile websites are abandoned if pages take longer than 3 seconds to load. And that's from 2016. Do you think people are more patient now? Probably not. There's also business reasons. For example, Starbucks implemented a 2x faster time to interactive, resulting in a 65% increase in their rewards registrations. AliExpress, which is a huge online merchant in China or based in China, where I can get all my glittery things for Mardi Gras. They reduced their load time by 36% and saw a 10.5% increase in orders. You can get a lot of stats like this on WPOstats.com. If that's not enough, speed is now used as a ranking factor for mobile searches for Google search. And if that's not enough, you can also be publicly shamed in the future. This is a mock-up of what for example, Google might do when you're loading a site that's slow, or Chrome, sorry. And if that's not enough, there's also an environmental implication. So the internet consumes 416 terawatts of electricity per year. Just a 10% savings would be equivalent to 6.2 million fewer cars on the road, 32 billion less pounds of coal being burned, or nearly 500,000 tree seedlings being grown for 10 years. And most of that energy is actually from the network and data centers, not even the user's devices. So there's even more savings there if we can reduce the amount of consumption that our phones are using. So why do we even care about typography? As Ellen Lupton says, who wrote this amazing book called Thinking with Type, typography is what language looks like. So we could do all of our websites in Arial and Times New Roman, but we might be missing a bit in terms of communication and emotion. I want you to take a look at this image and tell me what you think. What does it evoke in you? It might be friendly. It's kind of informal because it's lowercase. Also, the font kind of suggests that like friendliness or trustworthiness. But it's also like very confident and out there. It's big letters, it's at the top, and all of these things kind of evoke those emotions. Now let's look at this. It's the same exact word, but it evokes a different feeling inside of you, right? Like it is all caps, so maybe it's a little bit shouty, but it's also small and to the side, so maybe a little bit shy. So all of these things can evoke different feelings in us and also associate different feelings with different brands as well. So if we want to take a look at this other example, also all the same word, right? And these are of course very famous brands in the US. But one of them of course evokes sporty feelings, right? Another might be sophistication. And another makes me think of the kid on the corner shouting extra extra. So typography has meaning for us. So we don't want to just have every website in, maybe our system font stack, because then we're just evoking whatever operating system a user is on. Let's talk about web fonts. There's this small little website you might have heard from called Google Fonts, where we can grab fonts for free. And there's other ones like Typekit and others. Web fonts are great, right? They're hosted on fast and reliable CDNs. They can provide optimized variants based on a user's browser. Unfortunately, shared caching isn't really a thing anymore, and this is for privacy and security reasons. So if you used to use them because, you could share, if everyone was using Open Sans and we could all share the cache, well, that's actually a problem. So unfortunately, that's not a thing anymore. We now have control over flash of unstyled text and flash of invisible text, and I'll kind of show you what that means later if you don't know what I'm talking about. But unfortunately, we have a minimum of 2 separate requests. And we can't preload that font file. We'll talk about what that means. And it doesn't take advantage of HTTP2 multiplexing. All right, so let's take a look. What's going on with this page load? This is a waterfall from webpagetest.org, and you might be familiar with, for example, Chrome DevTools networking tab. This is very similar. So what we have here is a load, and we can see these skinnier lines are the connection, and then the fatter lines are different file types loading. When it's a light color, it's just wait time, and when it's a dark color, that's when bytes are actually being passed over the wire. So what's going on here? We have our HTML as the first line, so that's our initial connect in our HTML. Then we have our CSS, and then after that CSS, this other Google Fonts or fonts.googleapis.com is being triggered, and we have a long connection time, and then the file actually comes. And then after that, we have our fonts from, you see these WAF2s? Those are modern web fonts. So those are our fonts. Does this look efficient to you? It's not very efficient, and there's a few different things going on here. First of all, we know we're going to need this font, but it's not even starting until the CSS is downloaded. And that's because we have used our import inside of our CSS in order to load this font. And that's a very inefficient way to load fonts, because we're not even going to see it until that CSS is downloaded and the CSS font is created. So we want to put this in our HTML so that we can immediately start this connection. So let's take a look at that. So now we have our CSS being, or our font being loaded in our HTML. And maybe you weren't aware that when you grab that URL from Google Fonts, for example, you're actually downloading a CSS file. And that CSS file does your font face declarations. And after that, you finally get your fonts. But I want you to take a look here. So we have this connection to our domain. We have this one to fonts.googleapis.com. And then we have another one. Why do we have another one? Both of these are coming from Google, right? Well, they're actually on different domains. So you see this is fonts.gstatic.com, and then there's a long hash for the file name. So this is a little inefficient. Well, luckily, there's this little trick we can do. So there's that wasted time. There are things called resource hints that we can use to kind of trick our browser into doing things faster. And what I want you to focus on right now are these top two. So we can actually tell the browser to begin a connection handshake in the background before it actually knows we need to make that connection. So this says, go ahead and do all of our connections. So our DNS, Connect, and SSL negotiation. And then it's just sitting there primed and warmed up. This will eventually time out. So if you need to, for example, connect to something that you might not use until more than 3 seconds later, then you can use DNS prefetch, which will only do the DNS part of that pre-connection. And conveniently enough, this is the exact line you would put in your HTML head, near your Google Font call, and it will do that connection for you. So let's take a look at that. So here's our pre-connect on the top, and then our fonts call afterwards, and you can see this little connection is hanging out here when the browser has time to do it, and then it's ready to start downloading immediately once it knows that it needs those files. So that's pretty cool, right? So where is this available? We can use pre-connect on every major browser, And what's cool to know is you can actually use DNS prefetch as a fallback for Internet Explorer if you have a significant number of users on Internet Explorer. It's been available for a while longer. So that's pretty cool. Let's talk about self-hosted fonts. And when I say self-hosted, I mean the ones that you save in your own assets folders, for example, on your website. So this is what it might look like. You'll have a font face declaration, and in that source is the first thing that matches is what's going to be used. So this says if you have a local version of Mooly Lite, use that, or Mooly-Lite, or use this WAF2 next, because the WAF2 is for modern browsers, and it's also it's a better format, it's smaller, and it's great. But if they don't understand WAF2, then they'll go down to WAF. For the most part, you don't need the other ones. It depends on how many of the older browsers you're supporting. You can check that out on Can I Use. So this is what the load might look like. It's very similar to before, except we have only one domain because everything's on our own domain. We have our HTML, our CSS, and then afterwards our fonts are downloading. But there's another tweak we can do for important fonts. So this could be wasted time, and we're going to talk about the caveats a little bit later. So what we can do is we can use this preload hint. And this preload hint says to the browser, oh hey, I know I'm going to need this file. Why don't you go ahead and download it, even though you don't yet know that you need it? Because the browser is going to do its best effort to not download excessive files. So it's not going to download that file until that CSS sum is created and it knows that those characters are being used on that page. And so we can bypass that that performance check and say definitely download this. So what does that look like? That looks like our connection, downloading our HTML. Here's our CSS is actually down here. And then all of our files can begin downloading. A lot of these are waiting, and then they're actively downloading, when the connection is available. So that's what it looks like, all in parallel. You can just start downloading it right away. Of course, we want to be careful with this. We don't want to download resources that are not going to be used, so don't preload them unless you definitely are going to use them. And you don't want to excessively use this. It also kind of messes with the server prioritization, which a lot of services, even famous services like CloudFront, don't manage this well. They might over-prioritize your font versus your CSS, for example, and that would be bad because you want your CSS to come in fastest. And so we have to be very careful how we use this right now, even though it's a really cool tool. So what does adoption look like for this? It's available in all the major browsers except Firefox. Firefox used to have it, but then they put it behind a flag. So that's the status of it at the moment. Globally, that accommodates for 88.5% of browsers. You can actually, if, for example, you use Google Analytics, and I think maybe some other, if you can export data from other analytics providers, you can connect it to your Can I Use, and it will show you for your own website what's coverage for the users that come to your website. So you can see that it's actually a little bit lower. I probably have people coming from Firefox also. All right, but caveat time. Every site is unique, so we want to test, test, test. You always want to test and make sure that you're not delaying your render because you've preloaded too much. I like preload because, or at least for the most obvious font, because a lot of times you can skip that whole fallback font time, which is really cool. So you probably know about Chrome DevTools, but I'm going to show you another tool called Web Page Test, and you can find it at webpagetest.org. This is what a waterfall is. I'm not going to go over all of it right now, but I have this handy diagram that you can use when you're trying to figure out what's going on. But it looks like what we've been looking at. But what's really cool is you can check out, well, the blue line is document complete, and I think that's actually the same color as Chrome. And this green line is the first render, or the start render. So you really want to pay attention to everything that's on the left-hand side of this, because you might be delaying your render. For example, CSS and JavaScript are render blocking. And so you want to play with the stuff that's to the left of this in order to move this line to the left. We want that render to be faster. We want that user to know that that page is loading faster and not just never going to load. So what else can Web Page Test do? It's actually pretty amazing. It has this feature where you can get thumbnails too. So these are my thumbnails, and then as I scroll through this thumbnail timeline, if you take a look down here in my waterfall, it moves as well. So I can see exactly where what it looks like at that point in the waterfall. So we go over here and we see that. And then in this particular waterfall, I have a lot of stuff to the left of the green line. And I have a lot of little SVGs. Maybe I want to use lazy loading for those. Or this is 4 fonts I'm preloading. That's probably excessive. So I did do just a quick little test, and I changed that to only 2 of the fonts. And I also inlined an image that was in my masthead or Jumbotron or Hero, whatever you want to call it. And I actually moved my start render to the left some, which was great. All right, so that's a little caveat case study. Let's talk about rendering, or our user experience in font rendering. So this might be a little bit hard to see on your screen, but in the background you can see that there's a website and there's words. You see words in the navbar, words in the button. But if you see here in a screenshot during render, there's no words in my navbar or in my buttons. What's going on? Well, if you don't, there's this property called font display, and if you don't set it by default, it does font display block. And what that means is it's going to show invisible text for 3 seconds, and if it doesn't have the font in by then it will show the fallback. And then when the web font finally shows up, it will show the web font. So you have this time of up to 3 seconds where it's just invisible, and I think that's usually a terrible experience. If you have something that's highly associated with your brand, maybe you want that to happen. But what we can do is instead change it to swap. And if we do that, then it will show the fallback font immediately, and then the web font when it comes in. And then these other options are pretty cool to check out as well if you want to try them. This glitch is a really cool way you can play with all of those different settings. All right. So, yay, Google Fonts actually has the ability to change it to display swap. And even on your old projects, you don't need to go in and recopy the URL. You can just add these params to the URL. So, ampersand display equals swap, and you'll be set to have your font swap instead of block. That's pretty cool. Let's talk about flash of unstyled text. So what do I mean? This is while my font's loading, and then it switches once it loads. I'm going to pause that because, it's a lot of movement going on. That can be annoying. This is one of my pet peeves. Like I'm reading an article, and then the font, maybe there's a header image, finally loads, and all of a sudden I'm on 5 paragraphs away from where I started. And that's very frustrating for a user. So for me, and then people have different opinions on this as well, but for me, I want my fallback not necessarily to match so much the style, but the way that the page flows. So horizontally, especially vertically. And so how can we even figure that out? That seems very frustrating to try to find a good fallback. Well, Monica, and I can't pronounce her last name, she made this really cool tool called Font Style Matcher. And if we take a look at that, and I actually have an example I was playing with here, you can have a fallback font set here, so something that's just available in the system or as a web-safe font. And she already has preloaded all the Google fonts. So if I deleted Oswald, I would see the full list of Google fonts. And then you can also upload a font if it's not there. So all of this is really cool. And then down here you can see this is, let me put this back to Oswald. This is what it looks like rendered as Arial Narrow, and this is Oswald. And so you can change all of these settings. I don't usually play with these settings as much because I don't want to use any JavaScript to reset them once my other file loads in. But you can definitely play with those. And then down here you can, for example, use different colors. So one's in red and one's in black. And you can also see that video that I just showed you. Sometimes people will come in here and then they'll adjust these enough. So that's the wrong way. Line height maybe you want to adjust. You can adjust these enough, and then eventually they end up liking what they've created as a fallback font and won't even use the web font anymore. So this is a really great tool if you're looking for a good fallback font that doesn't shift as much, or if you're looking to even replace one of your fonts. So Font Style Matcher, great tool. I don't know if any of you have heard of variable fonts. They're really cool. I have one on my personal website, Sia.codes, and it's amazing. The only problem is it's huge. We're not going to go over what all variable fonts can do, but they're really cool. You should check them out. Actually, Recursive is the one that I use, and their website is pretty amazing. So you can get an idea of what a variable font does. It can do all of these different combinations as just one font. The only thing is, if you think about it, this can get pretty big. Sometimes it's more efficient. I feel like most of the time it ends up being bigger, but it's more flexible. Maybe you only need this one font now rather than like 4 different fonts to load. But I want to take a look at my code and show you what that looks like, or one way I try to overcome this problem. So I have my font face declarations and I started subsetting. So this subset is for the minimum for the English language. You can set Unicode ranges, so your CSS knows that this font file is going to cover these Unicode ranges. And then you can do other ones. For example, this is my European Diacritics, which I probably rarely use on my website, so it's only going to load this font if the HTML shows that a Unicode in this range is used on that page. So subsetting is another great option you can do. People even subset like their base font, and there's some cool tools for that as well. I have a link later on in the presentation. So some of the resources mentioned, I have an article called Making Google Fonts Faster, and that shows you how you can actually download the font as well and host it locally if you so choose. How to import your analytics into Can I Use, and Subfont is one of those packages you can use. If you're using something like Gatsby, I think there's things like Gatsby Subfont or things like that. So yeah. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you a lot for spending your pre-Halloween with me. And you can find all the slides again at bit.ly/font-perf. And you can learn more about me at sia.codes, and you can tweet at me. I'm at the Green Creep.